We are recording. Let me share my screen the correct way. All right, so can someone confirm that you can hear me and see the screen? It's not good. Hello?
You good?
Oh, thank you. I was about to type in the chat. Chat. I appreciate it. Well, anyway, since we're recording, I might as well do the announcements now. I know not everybody's here, but they can ask me later. Really, the only thing I need to announce is remind you that this week's lab is a free lab, meaning we're not going to meet. There's no lab to do. I'm just hoping that you'll use that time to redo one of your lowest grades for the lab. So you just choose whichever one you want to do. No matter what you do, though, your grade for this week is I'm just going to choose your highest lab grade that you have so far, and I'm going to use that again. So there's nothing you need to do. You don't need to let me know anything. Again, I just hope you'll use that time to catch up on old labs if you missed anything or fix any old corrections. But anyway, let's jump into it. We need to be quick. This is the last week, and we have a lot of ground to cover. So I am going to go quick. If you have any questions, just write them down and maybe ask me afterwards. Because, like I said, we need to really get through this. Um, where are we at? Slideshow. There we go. We'll do attendance the way we normally do. I'm going to give you a bunch of words. If you're watching this with me, you do not need to take screenshots. If you're watching a video, you're going to need to take a screenshot every time I say one of those words. So, for example, right now, the first word is going to be community. So if you are watching this video and not on the live stream with me right now, you're going to take a screenshot, and the first picture you're going to send me is going to be what I can see here with this the word community underlined. But anyway, let's jump forward. And like I said, please forgive me for going fast. Write something down if you have questions, and then afterwards let me know, because I'm not even going to ask if anybody has questions. I'm just going to go through this. I'm also going to skip this. This PowerPoint is based off of the old textbook, as I have been doing a lot recently, as you've noticed. And normally I like to talk about this, but again, we're running short on time, so I'm going to go through that. Same with this. The beginning of every chapter in the old textbook has something called Biology and Society, where they give you this little story of a recent news article that, makes it relevant to everyday life. You can read it about it if you want. I'm not going to test you on it. Here we go. This chapter is going to be broken down into these four main bullet points, which is an overview of population ecology. Then we're going to talk about population growth models. Then we're going to talk about applications of population ecology. So we're going to learn just population ecology in general, what's it mean, and then we're going to learn how it's used. And then specifically, we'll get into human population growth, which is really applying these concepts to human issues, obviously. So here we go. Let's talk about an overview of population ecology. First thing you need to know is what a population is. And I mentioned this earlier. I think, last week was the first time I think you were officially presented with the word population. And it is a group of individuals of a single species that occupy the same area at the same time. This should look very familiar. I think it was slightly different the way I presented it last week. But as usual, when it comes to definitions, I don't really care that you understand, know them verbatim. I prefer you just to know what they mean, right? So we could rewrite this sentence to say something like a group of individuals of the same species that are in the same place at the same time, relying on the same resources, influenced by the same environmental factors, and likely to interact and breed with one another. So that's what you need to know. I know I said I wouldn't do this, but does anybody have any questions about what a population is? Okay, and to remind you, we're about to learn about population ecology. So before we can learn about population ecology, you need to understand what population is, and that's what a population is. And I'll use the same example I used last week. For example, the gray squirrels on WVSU's campus, that's a population, right? So there might be other gray squirrels that live in Georgia. So it's the same species, but they're not at the same area. They're not dealing with the same things. They're not relying on the same resources. So even though they're the same species, then that hypothetical situation, there are actually two different populations. So then that brings us to what population ecology is. Population ecology is concerned with changes in the population size of a population, obviously, right? And the factors that regulate populations over time. So in other words, knowing what a population is, right? Think about that. And then we say, what is population ecology? Basically, we're just studying the things that make a population go up and down, right? So what causes that? And that's what we're going to learn in this chapter. Population can be described in a few ways. First of all, the most common, I think, is population size, right? So when we talk about, hey, what's the population of West Virginia? And I don't know this for sure, but I think, of humans. So 1.8 million, maybe? I don't know. Anyway, but right, we're very often used to the population being described by its size. Also, the age structure. So again, using West Virginia as an example, West Virginia has per capita more older people than a lot of other states. Population density. So using again the same example, I think New York City has about the same number of people as the entire state of West Virginia. So then when you think about the density, right? So New York City geographically is a lot smaller than the state of West Virginia. So the population density is a lot higher. But anyway, we're going to talk about all three of those things separately. That was just an introduction. If you download this PowerPoint, you can click on this to watch a little video about population ecology. And the next word for attendance is the one that I have the arrow pointed to it. So I'm not even going to say it. So if you happen to be online and you're listening to this lecture and you've got your eyes closed, which is A-okay, and you're just relaxing and listening, I need you to open your eyes and see where the arrow is pointing, because that's the next attendance word. And of course, if you're watching this video at a later date, when you send the screenshot, you should see a picture of a red arrow pointing at the word. Anyway, let's move forward and talk about these things. Here's just some pictures from the old textbook. I'm not even going to get into it. But let's also talk about population dynamics before we talk about those other things we mentioned earlier, like population size, density, things like that. Population dynamics is defined as interactions between the biotic and abiotic factors that cause a variation in population size. So that being said, if we back up a step, we could rewrite population ecology. You could just say population ecology is concerned with the changes in population size and population dynamics, because if you look at interactions between the biotic, which means living, and abiotic, non-living factors that cause variation in population size, which is all this is saying, right? We're concerned with the change in population size and the things that make it go up or down. That's all that means. And again, to remind you, biotic means living. So, again, using the gray squirrels as an example, one of the biotic factors they have to deal with is probably feral cats, right? There's probably feral cats trying to kill them. They probably have to put their nests in a safe place. Otherwise, the cats will kill their little babies. Then they're also dealing with abiotic factors. So a good example of that would be, the temperature, right? The climate of West Virginia. All these things affect the population size. Anyway, that's what population dynamics is. And an important aspect of population dynamics is population growth, which we will discuss. Here's an example of humans' population growth. This is an old picture. I wish I knew when this picture was made, but it's pretty accurate. We did in fact hit 8 billion last year. But anyway, this is just an example. When you're studying, please don't feel like you need to remember, okay, in 1804 it was 1 billion, in 1927 it was 2 billion. You don't need to know that. We will discuss the shape of this graph a little bit later. It is an important graph, and the fact that it has a slow slope at the beginning and then starts, getting really high, that is significant, but we'll talk about it later. For now, that picture is just to show you population growth. So what do we use population ecology for? Few things. First of all, it provides information for conservation and restoration projects. That's obviously very important in West Virginia. Here's a picture of a strip mine, right? So it's not like when coal mining companies go in here and do their mountaintop removal. They have rules and regulations. They can't just leave it like you see it in that picture, right? There's rules about how they need to fix it and what plants they need to put in there. And that is actually what population ecology is for, because it's not as simple as just saying, all right, just throw some grass, now that you're done, just throw some grass seeds on there, right? It's not like that. It gets deeper, and we'll talk about the aspects of that in this chapter. But again, to make informed decisions, we need people researching these things, because again, it's not as easy just saying, throw some grass seed down there. It's also used to develop fisheries. That's something we'll talk about later in this chapter, and also something that's relevant in West Virginia. They stock rivers with trout and things like that. And again, that takes population ecology. It takes scientists to figure that out. Like how many how many trout do we need to use, and what age should we put them into this river, and at what time of the year should we put them into this river, right? All these things that people have to figure out. It's not as easy as just throwing a bunch of fish into the river. It's also used to manage wildlife populations. So all the things I just said about the fisheries, the same thing could be said, for example, about hunting, right? So again, there's all these regulations and rules, and there's scientists behind that. It's not as simple as saying, hey, it's deer season, go kill, just go, you're allowed to kill 5 deer, whatever the number is, right? It's not like a random guess. People are doing research to figure out exactly how many you should take and how old they should be and when in the year you should do it, and things like that. And then finally, it provides insight into controlling how pests and pathogens are spread. And of course, that's relevant anywhere. But anyway, we'll talk about all of these things in a little bit more detail as this chapter goes on. Like I said earlier, one of the ways we can discuss population is considering population density. And I said we were going to come back and talk about that in more detail. So here we are. Let's talk about population density in more detail. The definition is it's the number of individuals of a species per unit area or volume of the habitat. So, I mean, it's pretty simple, right? It's like how many things of this species are living in this area, right? Whether that be square miles, like a lot of times in the United States, when we talk about humans, we say, yeah, there's 100 people per square mile. Or, other things in biology. These are just some examples, so it's not like you need to know them. But you might consider largemouth bass per cubic kilometer, right? Because if you're talking about water, you're not looking at square kilometers, you're looking at cubic, right? This is three-dimensional. If you're looking at oak trees, maybe you want to know how many oak trees are in, I don't know, Kanawha State Forest. You would write that down as oak trees per square kilometer, perhaps. Anyway, so on and so forth. Again, those are just examples. If you download this PowerPoint, you can also click that little link and watch a little video about human population density. So then the question is, how do we measure population density? And you might not think about that very often, because when it comes to humans, it's pretty simple, right? For humans, especially in the United States, we really very much know the population and the population density, right? Because every time someone's born, for the most part, we have a record of it. Every time someone dies, for the most part, we have a record of it. Every time someone enters the country, for the most part, we have a record of it. Every time someone leaves the country, for the most part, we have a record of it, right? And then we do a census every 4 years where somebody goes door to door, literally asking how many people live in your house and things like that. So for humans, we just do it, right? But in most cases, outside of humans, when I just talk about biology, it's very impractical, if not impossible, to count all the individuals of a population. Using the same example as I used previously about how many oak trees are in Kanawha State Forest. I bet if you were to look it up, somebody knows the answer to that question. And I almost guarantee you the person who knows the answer to that question didn't go out and count every single oak tree in the Kanawha State Forest. But there are methods where you can collect samples, and someone's done the statistics so they can tell you exactly how much data you need to be able to statistically say, yep, we can confidently say that there are this many oak trees in this area, right? Just using that as an example. But anyway, again, since it's not normally practical or even possible sometimes for us to get an exact count, these ecologists used different methods. I'm going to put an X next to this, just reminding you that these are examples, so you don't need to memorize this. But, if somebody studies a specific species of bird, then they can probably know, all right, well, if there's a bird nest here, then that means there's probably X number of birds that live in this nest. And knowing that they're, knowing about their territory, then there's probably no other birds within I don't know, 1 mile radius or whatever it may be, right? They know, because they study, these population ecologists study these populations, then they could just count the number of bird nests and from there extrapolate the data. Or, using the same mindset, if someone's studying a particular type of rodents, but they know the population. So when they see one hole, they're like, oh, well, that means there's probably this many rodents that live there, and there's probably no more in a certain amount of area, so on and so forth, right? Same with termite mounds. Any other thing you can think of where, again, no one's going out and counting every single individual of a population. So when someone tells you there's X number of deer, for example, in West Virginia, it's not because someone went out and counted every single deer in West Virginia. It's because they have their ways of making the estimates. And here's just a picture from the old textbook, as an example of the rodent burrows, right? So there's some groundhogs. So whoever studies groundhogs can look and count the number of holes, and probably from there figure out the number of groundhogs in that area. Let's talk about population age structure. The age structure of a population is the distribution of individuals in different age groups. So again, using the example I used previously, West Virginia has an older population structure. So we have more, like our ratio of older people to younger people is a little bit higher than a lot of other places. But this is important. I'll give you some examples a little bit later in this PowerPoint, but it's important because it provides insight into the history of a population's survival. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Its reproductive success, which I'll give an example for later, and how the population relates to environmental factors. And again, we've got another slide that's going to give an example of this. And there we go. This is a great example. So let's say there's some scientists and they're studying I don't know what kind of bird that is. I'm not an ornithologist, but let's say they that they just got to this area. Looks like it's the desert because there's a cactus. But anyway, they just got to this area and they want to study this population of birds. Now, like I said, they just got there. So they don't have the ability to go back in a time machine and study this bird for 11 years. But by looking at the age structure, they can get some insight, right? So they're doing, they're studying all these birds. They're trying to find as many as they can. They're making measurements and figuring out how old they are. And then they're able to establish the age structure, right? So here's the age structure. Here's the percent of the population, right? So you can see when they started their study, 0% of the population is 2 years old or 3 years old or 10 years old, right? But they can see nearly 50% of the population is about 4 years old. So even though they just started the study, they can determine a lot from this, right? So it's clearly something very bad happened 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and 10 years ago. So then that person who's studying this population, they can just do some research. Like, all right, well, let's look at some things. What happened 2, 3, and 10 years ago? Like, was it a little bit wetter than usual? Was it a little bit drier than usual? Was it a little bit hotter than usual? Colder than usual? Whatever it is, right? And then because of that, the scientists who's studying this population of birds can then defer or figure out that, okay, well, whatever happened 2, 3, and 10 years ago, that must be something bad for this population of birds. And also what happened 4 years ago, right? What caused them to do so well 4 years ago? And again, they could just look at old information and see if there's any common factors and say, oh, well, and again, going back to this old slide, what caused them to have great reproductive success 4 years ago? What were some environmental factors that happened 4 years ago? So they can determine all these things. The next word for attendance is bird, since we have a bird on the screen. And again, if you're watching the video at a later date, so not if you're online with me right now, but if you're watching this later, you should take a screenshot. And in the screenshot, I should see the bird and a circle on that graph and so on and so forth. All right, so something that's related to population age structure is something called life tables and survivorship curves. So let's talk about that. A life table tracks the survivorship of individuals in a population. And what is survivorship? Survivorship is the chance of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages. That'll make a lot more sense when I actually show you a life table for humans in the upcoming slides. The reason this is important is because it helps to determine the most vulnerable stages of the life cycle. And again, the example I'm about to give you here, this is for humans, so we might not think about that, right? Because for humans, we're just taking care of them, right? We just take care of ourselves. But if you're a population ecologist and using the examples I used previously, trying to determine, at what age should we put these trouts into this river, and at what time of year, right? You want to find out the most vulnerable ages, right? Because you want to make sure they're protected at the most vulnerable age. So that's why that would be useful. But let's look at this human example. What this is saying, and this might look confusing, but it's really not. To simplify it, what we're saying here is the chances of somebody being born and then reaching the age 10 is about 99.2%, right? And then the chances of somebody then reaching it, turning 10, but then also reaching it to the age of 20 is about 99.6%. So you can see the chances actually go up a little bit. But then the chances of hitting 30, go down to about 99%, so on and so forth. And what you can tell, not that this is important, it's just an example, but you can see here that like the chances slowly start decreasing for humans getting from one decade to the next. But then once you start getting older, like at your 60s and 70s, you can see that it really starts dropping off quickly. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, there's nothing to memorize here. This is just an example of a life table. And again, to remind you, for humans, it's a little bit different. But if you're a population ecologist trying to figure out the rules for deer hunting, for example, right, you need to know when they're the most vulnerable. That brings us to something called a survivorship curve, which plots the individuals that are still alive at each age in the maximum lifespan. So in other words, it's a graph of this, right? A survivorship curve, as far as we're concerned, is a graph of a life table. The way it's a little bit different, though, well, sort of, it uses percentage scales and not actual ages. And you'll see what I mean on this next slide. So, for example, humans maybe live up to be 100 years old, right? Squirrels don't live up to be 100 years old. I don't know how the average age of a squirrel is, but I don't know. I'm thinking maybe 10 years. I have no idea. Oysters definitely don't live that long. The point is, by doing a percentage, right? So instead of actual ages, we can look at these different kinds of, we can compare different species, right? So we can compare a long living species like a human to a short living species like an oyster, because this isn't ages on the x-axis, it's the percentage of the maximum lifespan. That out of the way, here's what you need to know for the exam, what these curves show. You can see, like I showed you on the table previously, like for humans, right, the chances of surviving, when you're young, the chances of survival are very high. And then once you start getting older, your chances of surviving go way down, right? And what you need to know for the exam is what we call that is a type 1 survivorship. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but humans are a great example because we are humans. There's some other examples. We'll talk about that later, but you do need to know that a type 1 survivorship, the chances of surviving when you're young is very high. And then as you get older, your chances drop dramatically. And then you need to know the opposite of that, which was type 3 survivorship. In this case, the chances of surviving when you're young are very low, right? And then once you reach an older age, which is very unlikely, then your chances of surviving actually increase. And a great example, again, using oysters as an example, not that I expect you guys to be familiar with oysters, but what they will do to reproduce is, the females will just put out a bunch of eggs out into the water, just squirt a bunch out, and they go with the flow, and they land where they land, and maybe they make it, and maybe they don't. And that's why the percentage the percentage of the young surviving are so low, right? I'll give you more examples later. And then the other thing you need to know is the type 2 survivorship curve. So again, type 1 is like humans, type 3 is like the opposite of humans, and type 2, it's right up the middle, right? So basically in type 2, your chances of surviving or dying or whatever it may be, it's pretty much constant throughout your life. So there's not particularly any kind of vulnerable part of the life cycle. Anyway, let's move forward. Again, here's everything I just said, but now it's in writing. I'm just going to read it really quickly since I've already explained it in the previous slide. Type 1 survivorship produces, I didn't mention this, but they typically produce few offspring, right? Even humans back in the day when they produced more than they do now on average, you might get like 8 to 12 kids, but even that's not many compared to like a type 3 survivorship. They also give relatively good care to their offspring, right? So again, humans as an example, generally speaking, when they have a baby, they take care of it. And again, there's an increasing likelihood that they'll survive to maturity. So basically, being young is not the vulnerable part of the life cycle for anybody in a type 1 survivorship curve. Type 3, again, is the opposite. There's low survivorship for the young. That needs to be fixed. So I'll just put a Y there. Low survivorship for the young, followed by a period of when survivorship is very high for the few individuals who live to a certain age. And to compare this bullet point to the first one, type 3 produce a lot of offspring, right? Because most of them aren't going to make it. Type 3 don't give good care to their offspring. Like, as you said, with the oysters, for example, right? They're just squirting their eggs out into the ocean and just let the current take them, and whatever happens, happens. So again, type 3 is the opposite of type 1 and vice versa. And then, of course, there's type 2, which again is kind of the intermediate between the two, where survivorship is constant over the lifespan. So again, another way of saying that is there's not necessarily any vulnerable stage for their life cycle. So you do need to know the differences between these three types of survivorship for the exam. Let's talk about life history traits as adaptations. In other words, well, you'll see. So anyway, life history, what is that? Life history is the set of traits that set the schedule for reproduction and survival. So in other words, when you're talking about life history of any particular species or even a population of a species, you're basically describing when and how often they reproduce, right? And how many offspring do they have, and how much care do they give to their offspring, and also survival, which we've already previously talked about. So, a population's pattern of survivorship is an important feature of its life history, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, the key life history traits include, and I've already mentioned some of these again, the age at first reproduction, right? So, at what age? Well, can they first reproduce? The frequency of reproduction, the number of offspring they generally, as an individual of that population would generally have at once, and again, the amount of parental care given. So all the stuff I said previously, right there it is in writing. Now, the reproductive success, as we already know from the previous chapter when we talked about evolution, is the key to evolutionary success, right? So it's not just survival of the fittest, right? Because it's one thing if you survive and that's all good and well, but the whole advantage of survivorship when it comes to evolution is the ability then to reproduce because you're alive. And it's a combination of these life history traits right here, the combination of what age they first reproduce and how often do they reproduce and how many offspring do they have, all that stuff, right? It's a combination of those things where there's trade-offs that balance the demands of reproduction and survivorship. And it's because selective pressures vary, life histories are also very diverse. And this brings us to some other things you need to know. And in a sense, these are very much related to like type 1, type 2, and type 3, and you'll see what I mean. But now we're kind of looking at it in a slightly different context. So there's different ways of describing it. For example, the first one we're going to talk about is something called the opportunistic life history. And this type of life history takes immediate advantage of favorable conditions. And you should associate this with type 3 survivorship. So this is dandelion's a great example. Each one of these little things is a seed. And this is a great time of year as an example, because you'll see one day you've got none of them in your yard, and the next day there's a bunch of them because all of a sudden conditions are right. So they take advantage of it. Those flowers form quickly. They spread their seeds, right? That's a great example of type 3 survivorship. And also to remind you previously, like I've said earlier, type 3 survivorship usually have a lot of offspring and don't give very good care to their offspring. And this is a great example because each one of those seeds, when you think about it, is an offspring of that flower. And it's not giving good care. And it's a lot of seeds because its goal, it's a way of adapting the way that species is adapted, just put out as many seeds as possible with the hope that some of them will make it. And that is an opportunistic life history. The opposite of that is equilibrial life history. And you need to know both of those for the exam. And this is, again, just basic. This is the opposite of opportunistic history. So organisms that use equilibrial life history, they reach sexual maturity slowly, unlike that dandelion that we used as an example. They produce few well-cared-for offspring. And I chose this picture because this is a coconut. These are coconuts, right? That's a palm tree. And people, again, I don't think most people associate seeds with offspring because, when you think of offspring, you might think of animals, and like this picture on the right with this elephant and a little baby elephant. But seeds are also offspring. And again, using this as an example, since I used a seed as an example for an opportunistic life history, this is a great example of seeds with equilibrial life history. So there's fewer seeds, right? Coconuts, palm trees create fewer offspring, which are coconuts, and those coconuts are the seeds. And they are relatively well cared for. Like those things are meant to float so they can, survive in the water. And there's a lot of, meat, so to speak, in there and liquid, right? So those things they're very well cared for. Once they get where they're going, they're in a great position to actually create a new palm tree. They've got all that stuff in that seed. Anyway, they're typically larger bodied and longer lived. Again, great examples. Think about an entire palm tree, the size of that versus a small little dandelion. And of course, Elephants are obviously a good example. And they typically exhibit a type 1 survivorship as opposed to a type 3 survivorship. So, again, if anything, just remember that equilibrial life history is essentially the opposite of opportunistic life history. The next slide I'm going to show you compares key traits of opportunistic and equilibrial life history patterns. And here it is. This is, I think, not from your textbook. So if you wanted to study it, you would need to study this PowerPoint, because again, I don't think it's from your textbook. But it just compares all these different things, like where, opportunistic versus equilibrial. What kind of climate do they like? What's their maturation time? What's their lifespan? What's their death rate? All these things. And you should know this, but if anything, like I said, the most important thing is just remember they're opposite of each other, right? Remember that first. Then you can start adding these little details if you want to. Good. We finished the first main bullet point. Let's jump into the second main bullet point. It would be nice if we could get through half of this chapter today. All right, population size fluctuates, and you need to know this, and it's pretty common sense. There's two things, well, I guess you could say four things that cause the population size to fluctuate. The first one is when new individuals are born or move into the area, right? That would cause it to increase. The opposite would be as individuals die or move away, that would cause it to decrease. So those are the four things that cause the population size to fluctuate, and you need to know that for the exam. And we have models to investigate how the size of a population may change over time under different conditions. And that's what we're going to talk about, is these models, these population growth models that show how things may change under different conditions. So here we go. This seems to be a theme you guys might have noticed in this chapter, especially in this recent parts of this chapter. It's like we'll describe something, we'll just have some way of describing something, and then there seems to be like two opposing terms, right? And that's the same situation here. So here you're going to learn about exponential population growth, and then you're going to learn about, I don't want to call it the opposite, but a little bit like the opposite, and you'll see why, the logistic population growth model. So there's these two different growth models. We're going to talk about both of them, and you're going to need to know what both of them are for the exam. So here we go. The first one is exponential population growth. This is the expansion of a population in an ideal and unlimited environment. You need to know that, right? This is an ideal and unlimited environment. Now, granted, technically nothing is unlimited, and we'll talk about that here shortly. But academically, just for the sake of having some sort of definition or description, that's what it is. With exponential population growth, the population size of each new generation is calculated by multiplying it by a current factor that represents the birth rate minus the death rate. So in other words, the population growth rate, which is a good independent work question. I'm sorry I haven't been giving you ideas for that previously or earlier today, but that's a good thing to look up. Pick any organism that you might be interested in, any population, and look up what's the population growth rate. You can look up what's the population growth rate for humans worldwide versus what's the population growth rate for humans, I don't know, in the United States, or I don't know, in China or in West Virginia, right? You could look up all these different things. And well, again, we'll talk about it here in these upcoming slides. This accelerating growth rate of a population, and this is a horrible graph, but you'll see a better one than the actual picture later, right? It starts off slow, but then it gets bigger or faster and faster and faster and faster. And that produces a J-shaped curve. And that actually will be a test question. And it might show a picture of it, but it will actually ask it in those words. And, it'll ask something about an exponential population growth. And you should think, oh yeah, J-shape, that should be associated with exponential population growth. So the slope shows how rapidly population is growing. So let's just say this is population A, and I don't know what that is. Just think of something. I don't know. The population of oak trees. I don't know. Let's just say that's population A, and then you also have population B, and you might get a test question like this too, where you see this, and then the question might say, which population is growing quicker? And I would normally ask one of you, but I'm kind of in a rush, so I'll just give you the answer. Obviously, population A grew a lot quicker than population B, because here on the x-axis is time, right? Time is on the x-axis. Population number is on the y-axis. So you can see whatever number this is, population A got there way before population B got there. So that's all it's saying. So this type of growth is common in certain situations. Like I said previously, this is the expansion in an ideal and unlimited environment. But like I said, in all reality, nothing is unlimited. But there are things that are relatively unlimited. Some examples you can see here, like after a fire or a flood or a hurricane or a drought or a cold snap. Basically, if there's something that kills a lot of things, then a lot of times once the population comes back, it's going to be coming back in an exponential population growth model, because things are relatively unlimited, right? Because so many other things died, you've got all these resources, right? You're not competing for resources, whether it be water or soil or food or shade or sun or whatever it is that that population needs. There's because so many other things died, it's relatively unlimited. So the population grows thusly. Here's another example. See, this is better. This is a better curve. This is an actual example of the population of whatever type of rabbit that is. But you can see here this J-shaped curve. And again, you might get a question too, where I give you two populations, maybe like this, and say, here's population one, here's population two. Which population grew quicker? And that answer obviously would be population one. But anyway, just an example. Again, J-shaped curve. This is exponential growth model. Again, the opposite of that, if you will, sort of like the opposite, is the logistic population growth model. Like I mentioned earlier, and this is really not correct either. I should say, there we go. Environments are not unlimited, right? So they might seem unlimited for a while, using, again, the example of a fire or a flood or whatever it is, something that wipes out most of everything that's alive. Then things are relatively unlimited. But eventually what happens is things do become limited, right? As your population explodes and you're all competing for the same resources, then things do become very limited. And this is where we come up with this term limiting factors. And you need to know what limiting factors are. These are environmental factors that restrict population growth. So basically, it's saying when you look at the size of a population and the growth rate of a population, what we're saying limiting factors are, it's anything that slows down the population growth, right? It controls the numbers of individuals that can occupy a habitat. I'll give you some more examples and some more terms here. Another important word that you need to know for the exam is something called carrying capacity. And that's the maximum size that a particular environment can sustain. And just to keep my examples consistent, again, if you were to look at the number of oak trees in the Kanawha State Forest, I bet, excuse me, not the number of oak trees total, but the population density, right? However many oak trees there are per square kilometer, whatever, that probably hasn't changed much because it's probably reached its carrying capacity, right? There's as many oak trees as there probably can be, in that area. Because if there could be more, there would be, right? Nature would be like, yeah, we have the resources. There's going to be more, but there's not more resources, right? So instead, we hit this carrying capacity, and this will make a little bit more sense when I show you a graph of it. But this is something we call logistic growth. And again, remember that's what we're talking about, is logistic growth, the logistic population growth model. So logistic growth, again, is almost like the opposite of what we talked about previously, which was exponential growth. But they are related, because even in logistic growth, as you'll see a better graph later, but it starts the same. We've got this J-shaped curve, population's exploding, but then all of a sudden, well, you're running out of resources, and now your population growth rate stops, and eventually you just even out, right? So that at that point, the population is not necessarily getting bigger or smaller. You've just reached the carrying capacity, and that's what happens. So yes, you need to know what logistic growth is. You need to know what carrying capacity is. You need to know that the population, once it hits carrying capacity, the growth rate goes to zero. In other words, it flattens out, right? There's not generally more. The population is not growing. It's not shrinking. It's just flattened out. So there's a better example, right? Here's an actual picture. I think this is from the old textbook. Another thing I love about this too, because now I can reiterate or point something out that I haven't previously. This red line represents the model, right? This is what we expect to see. These black dots represent the actual numbers, right? So someone did collect data from this population of seals, and this was at the actual population size. And you can see they don't fit the model perfectly, but they are close. And the thing too, you can see here when they hit carrying capacity, which is right here, sometimes they go over carrying capacity, right? But then, now you're out of resources, and some of the individuals are going to starve to death, or whatever resources it is that you don't have enough of. So therefore, the population goes below carrying capacity, right? And it kind of fluctuates, but it does generally fit the model, just not exactly. And the next slide I'm going to show you compares logistic growth with exponential growth. Again, like I mentioned earlier, with that whole idea of that red line versus the dots, both of these are theoretical ideas, right? These are just models, so they don't necessarily always, the population growth doesn't always necessarily fit the way we expect it to. So here we go. Let's talk about it a little bit more, and there you go. There's logistic growth example is the seal. Exponential growth example is that rabbit. So pretty simple stuff. Again, for logistic growth, once the population hits carrying capacity, the population quits changing. The population size, right, quits changing. It's not getting higher. It's not getting lower. It's just pretty much staying at that number. So that being said, one of the concepts we mentioned when we were talking about these different models was something called limiting factors, right? These things that affect how quickly or slowly that a population is growing or shrinking, right? This is the things we're going to talk about. And you need to know the difference between them. So again, we're talking about factors that affect the population size. And there's different types. The first one is called density dependent factors. These are limiting factors. Well, everything I'm about to teach you are different types of limiting factors. But these are specifically where the intensity of the factor is related to the population density. In other words, I'll give you some examples first. Like, and this is a good example right here. Hunger or food, right? So if food is the resource in this hypothetical example, then food would be the density dependent factor. Meaning, if you've got, 5 wolves per square mile versus 100 wolves per square mile, right? The ones where you have a lot more wolves per square mile, they're going to be more wolves that are starving. So again, that's just a great example of a density dependent factor, because it depends on how many individuals are in a specific area. Now, density dependent factors there's also some examples of density dependent factors, and intraspecific competition is one of them. And that is the competition between the same species for the same limited resource. So the example I just gave, and the example you can see on this picture here, that is a great example of intra-specific competition, right? You have the two members of the same species, and they're competing for the same resource. In this case, happens to be food. Obviously, there's the opposite of this would be interspecific competition. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Density dependent factors can do two things. Like, there's two basic ways that they can influence the size, the population growth rate. They could either lower birth rate or increase death rate, right? This should be common sense, right? So like we said previously, the 4 ways that a population will change size is if it'll increase, right? If individuals are being born or moving into the area. It'll decrease if individuals are dying or leaving the area. But also, or excuse me, yeah. So these are great examples, right? Density dependent factors can lower birth rates, increase death rates. I'll give you a couple of good examples on the next slide, but for now, we'll just leave it at that. So what are some examples of some density dependent factors? Not that you need to memorize this list, but again, you should know what a density dependent factor is. In the exam, I might give you an example. So I might give you an example of limited food or limited water, or maybe something that's not even on this list, and you should recognize it as density dependent. Or I might ask you like the definition of density dependent factors. But yeah, let's talk about these examples very quickly. Some of them are very obvious, right? So limited food, if you don't have enough food, individuals are going to starve. If you don't have enough water, individuals are going to be dehydrated and die from that. Limited shelter. That's one thing that humans maybe don't think about often, but yeah, sometimes, like birds need nests, for example. So if there's not enough room to have a good nest, that's going to make a difference. disease transmission. Obviously, so for example, West Virginia was one of the last states to get COVID-19 once it hit the United States, and that might have a lot to do with the fact that we have a small population density. We don't have a lot of people crammed into each other. Therefore, it's harder to spread any particular disease for the most part. And then here's one you might not think about much either, too: accumulation of toxic waste products. You can look that up for independent work, but it's just there's so many different varieties of that. For example, so certain bacteria, as it metabolizes whatever it is it's metabolizing, the byproduct of that might actually be deadly to the bacteria. And in normal situations, that might not matter. But if you have too many individuals in a small area, then that's going to be bad. And again, you could look up some specific examples for independent work if you want. The next word for attendance is going to be nesting. Nesting is the next word for attendance. And again, if you're watching the video at a later date, there should be a screenshot accompanying this. I should see this X and these 4 checks and this box around the word nesting. Let's move forward. We've got about 6 minutes left and some change. So here's some great examples. So we can see here, this is the, declining reproductive success of a song sparrows with increasing population density. So this is a great example of how birth rates, right? So this one's showing how as the population density increases, right? So that's what this x-axis is, right? So here we have, 10 birds per whatever square kilometer, whatever it may be. And then as the population density gets higher, we can see here, this is the mean number of offspring per female. So we can see here when there's 10 females per whatever square kilometer, you can see here that they are producing nearly 4 to 5 offspring at once. But we can see here as the population density gets higher and there's more of them around, that they're producing fewer, like 1 offspring, 1.5 offspring, right? The numbers get lower as the population density increases. And when you think about it, that makes sense because, like I said previously, birds need a nest to have offspring. They need a place to lay their eggs. So obviously, the higher the density, the more of them there are, right? The fewer places there are to find a nest, right? All the good spots are taken. Not only that, but you need material to make the nest with. So the more people, the more individuals you have using those resources, then the fewer nests, you're making a smaller nest. Your nest isn't as well hidden. It's not as well constructed. So therefore you are having fewer offspring. I hope that makes sense. And I like this too. So this is an example of lowering the birth rate, right? Which is one of the things we talked about. We said the other thing that affects it is increasing the death rate. And that's a great example of what we have here. We can see the death rate as the population density increases, the death rate also increases because of what's happening. These particular fish need to hide in this kelp. So the more of them there are, the fewer hiding spots there are, and therefore the more of them they get eaten by predators, right? So anyway, like I said, I would ask you if there's any questions, but I'm in a hurry. So if you have questions, I'm hoping you've written them down and you'll ask me later. But let's jump into this. Let's talk about, I guess you could say the opposite. So the opposite of what we just finished talking about. We just finished talking about density dependent factors. The opposite of that would be density independent factors. And this should be pretty simple, especially now that you know what density dependent factors are. These are just where the intensity of this factor is unrelated to density. So examples would be like changes in weather or climate, right? So for example, if we go into nuclear war and have some sort of miniature ice age because of nuclear winter, right? And everything starts getting, really freezing on WVSU's campus, for example, that's going to kill, in this hypothetical situation, let's just say it kills all the squirrels on our campus because regardless of how many they are, they're just not evolved to be in that cold weather. So they all die. Then there's things like, again, a fire. Floods are really good examples because we've had a lot of floods in our area, right? A flood's basically, for the most part, going to kill everything that it comes in that area, right? It doesn't matter if there's a bunch of them or a few of them. If you're in the way of the flood, you're just going to get killed, right? And obviously that's slightly different for humans, but for the most part, other things, right? If you get swept away in the floods, generally speaking, you're going to get killed. And again, it's independent of population density, right? A flood's going to kill, let's just say 100% or 90% of everything it touches. So anyway, you would need to know some examples of some disturbances. They might not even be on this list. Just use some common sense, right? If it would kill things regardless of what the population density is, that is density dependent. If the population density matters and affects it, that would be density dependent. Here's an example from the old textbook. We can see here that this particular population of aphids, which is a crop pest, you can see it explodes starting in the spring and up until summer, because again, like I said, it's a crop pest. So as its food becomes more, grows more, right? It has a lot to eat, therefore its population explodes. And then some things happen. Maybe the climate changes, right? Maybe it gets too hot in June, so all of a sudden most of them die off, right? Just one example. Nothing you need to memorize there for the exam. And then the old textbook likes to point this out, and I agree. In the long term, populations are actually regulated by complex interactions of density dependent and independent factors. So yes, those two things are different, but any given population for the most part is dealing with both of those things, right? They're dealing with climate, how a climate might change or a flood, but at the same time dealing with, disease transmission. So the last word for attendance, as usual, is going to be for you to ask me any question about the material presented in this lecture. And again, I'll remind you, you can ask me whatever you want, and I hope you do. If you have questions, let me know. But as far as the attendance word is concerned, it has to be about the material presented in this lecture, because it provides evidence that you paid attention. And that's all. I'm going to stop recording. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to stop recording yet. We are officially done. I'm done presenting new material, but does anybody have any questions now that I've rushed through everything? No questions. Nice and easy. All right. Well, I'm going to be online for office hours. Actually, I plan on being online all day if you need me. I have, again, I traveled over the weekend, so I have a lot of catching up to do with emails and grading and things like that. So forgive me for that. I have a meeting at 10 with my 108 students. That should last no longer than an hour. So again, if you need me, I'm online all day. Let me help you. This is our last week of class. So now as we're down to crunch time. So that's it. I'm going to stop presenting, stop recording. And again, I'll be online if you need me.